The morning sun painted the small mountain village in golden light, but for 19-year-old Sophia, this day felt darker than any storm cloud. She stood by her bedroom window, looking out at the same hills where she used to play as a child. Not knowing that her world was about to collapse completely, Sophia had always been different from other girls in her village. People would stop talking when she walked by, not out of disrespect, but because her beauty left them speechless. Her long black hair caught the sunlight like silk, and her green eyes seemed to hold secrets of the forest itself. Even the elderly, women in the marketplace, would whisper that they had never seen such a beautiful girl in all their years, but Sophia never thought much about her looks. She was too busy taking care of her sick mother and helping around their small house. Her father, Carlos, used to be a good man who worked hard in the local factory. That was before her mother got sick with a disease that the village doctor couldn't cure. The medical bills started small. A few $100s here and there for medicines and tests. But when they had to take her mother to the big city hospital, the costs became like a hungry monster that ate up everything they had. Carlos sold their cow first, then their small piece of farming land, and finally even her mother's jewelry that had been passed down through generations. Sophia watched her father changed during those terrible months. The man who used to sing while fixing things around the house became quiet and nervous. His hands started shaking and he would disappear for hours without saying where he was going. Sophia didn't know that her father had started gambling, hoping to win enough money to pay for her mother's treatment. When her mother finally passed away on a cold winter night, Sophia thought the worst was over. She was wrong. The debts didn't die with her mother. In fact, they seemed to grow bigger every day, like weeds after rain. The hospital wanted their money. The medicine sellers wanted their money. And worst of all, the dangerous men her father had borrowed money from wanted their payment too. Sophia tried her best to help. She took a job at the village bakery, waking up before sunrise to knead dough and serve customers. She also cleaned houses for the wealthy families on weekends. But the money she earned was like trying to fill a bucket with a huge hole in the bottom. No matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. Her father's gambling got worse after the funeral. He would come home at strange hours, sometimes with cuts on his face or torn clothes. Sophia would ask what happened, but he would just mumble something about bad luck and go to his room. She started hiding her small savings in different places around the house because she was afraid he might take that money too. One evening, when Sophia came home from work, she found her father sitting at their kitchen table with two men she had never seen before. They were wearing expensive suits that looked out of place in their simple home. Their eyes were cold like winter lakes, and they spoke in whispers that made her skin crawl. Her father looked up when she entered, and Sophia saw something in his eyes that terrified her. It wasn't just fear or sadness. It was the look of a man who had already given up, who had made a decision that couldn't be undone. The men left without saying hello to Sophia, but she caught pieces of their conversation. Words like valuable, unique, and perfect condition floated through the air like smoke. After they were gone, her father locked himself in his room and wouldn't talk to her for the rest of the night. Over the next few days, Sophia noticed strange things happening. Her father started asking weird questions about her personal life, things that made her uncomfortable. He wanted to know if she had ever had a boyfriend, if she had ever been intimate with anyone. When Sophia asked why he needed to know such private things, he would just say it was important and change the subject. Then came the day that changed everything. Sophia was folding clothes in her room when she heard voices from the kitchen again. She crept closer to listen and heard words that made her blood turn cold. The same men from before were talking to her father about an auction and a virgin girl who would bring a very high price. At first, Sophia couldn't believe what she was hearing. It seemed like something from a horrible nightmare, not real life. But as the conversation continued, the terrible truth became clear. Her father was planning to sell her to these men, who would then sell her to someone else like she was a piece of furniture. Sophia's hands started shaking as she listened to them discuss details. They talked about taking her to the city, about rich men who would pay enormous amounts of money for someone like her. They used words that made her feel sick to her stomach. treating her like she was nothing more than an object to be bought and sold. When the men finally left, Sophia confronted her father. She burst into the kitchen with tears streaming down her face, demanding to know if what she had heard was true. Her father couldn't look at her. He stared at the floor like a guilty child and mumbled something about having no choice, about the debts being too big, about the dangerous men who would hurt both of them if he didn't pay. Sophia begged him to find another way. She promised to work harder, to find more jobs, to do anything except what he was planning. But her father just shook his head sadly and said it was too late. The arrangements had already been made. In 3 days she would be taken to the city. That night, Sophia lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She thought about running away, but where could she go? She had no money, no family except her father, and no friends who could help her against such dangerous people. The village was small, and everyone would know if she tried to hide somewhere nearby. She also thought about her mother, wondering what she would say if she knew what was happening. Her mother had always taught her to be strong, to face problems with courage. But how could anyone be strong enough to face something like this? The next morning, Sophia noticed that her father had started locking her bedroom door from the outside when he left the house. He claimed it was for her safety, but Sophia knew the truth. He was making sure she couldn't escape before the horrible day arrived. As the hours passed, Sophia felt like she was trapped in a nightmare that kept getting worse. She could hear her father making phone calls in hushed tones, finalizing the details of her sale. Sometimes she heard him crying in his room at night, but didn't change his mind. The fear of what the dangerous men would do to him was stronger than his love for his daughter. On the final day, as Sophia sat in her locked room looking out at the mountains she might never see again, she whispered a prayer to her mother's spirit. She asked for a miracle, for someone to save her, for anything that might change her terrible fate. Little did she know that, in a city far away, someone was indeed preparing to step forward and change everything. The black van pulled up to an old warehouse on the edge of the city just as the sun was setting. Sophia had been sitting in the back seat for 3 hours, her hands tied and her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. The 2 men who had taken her from the village hadn't said a word during the entire trip, but their silence was somehow more frightening than any threats could have been. When they opened the van door, Sophia could smell something awful in the air. It was a mixture of old concrete, cigarette smoke, and something else she couldn't identify, but that made her stomach turn. One of the men, the taller one with the scar on his chin, grabbed her arm roughly and pulled her toward a rusty metal. The door inside the warehouse, Sophia's worst fears came to life. The huge space had been turned into something that looked like a twisted version of an auction house. There were rows of folding chairs filled with men in expensive suits, all talking quietly among themselves. At the front of the room was a small stage with bright lights pointed at it, like something from a theater, but somehow much more sinister. Sophia counted about 40 men in the audience, and every single one of them made her skin crawl. Some were old with gray hair and cold eyes that reminded her of dead fish. Others were younger but had the same hungry look that made her want to hide. They all had one thing in common, though. They looked at her like she was nothing more than a piece of meat they were thinking about buying. The man running the auction was a short, fat person with gold teeth who spoke in a voice that was both loud and oily. He welcomed everyone to what he called a very special evening and started explaining the rules. Sophia felt sick listening to him talk about her like she was a car or a house being sold. They made her stand on the stage under those burning hot lights while the auctioneer described her like she was a prize animal at a county fair. He talked about her age, her beauty, and other things that made her face burn with shame. The men in the audience leaned forward in their chairs, some of them even standing up to get a better look at her. Sophia tried to be brave, remembering what her mother used to tell her about staying strong during difficult times. But it was hard to feel strong when 40 pairs of evil eyes were staring at her like she was their next meal. She lifted her chin up and stared back at them with all the defiance she could gather, even though her whole body was shaking. The bidding started at a number so high that Sophia couldn't believe anyone would pay that much for anything, let alone for her. But these men started raising their hands and calling out even higher numbers like they were buying groceries. The auctioneer got more and more excited as the price went up, his gold teeth flashing under the lights. There was one man in particular who scared Sophia more than all the others. He sat in the front row and had the kind of face that belonged in nightmares. His skin was pale and stretched tight over sharp bones, and when he smiled, which he did often during the bidding, Sophia could see that several of his teeth were missing. Every time he raised his hand to bid, the other men would look nervous, and some would stop bidding altogether. This terrifying man seemed to have more money than everyone else, and as the auction went on, it became clear that he was going to win. Sophia felt like she was drowning in fear as she watched him get closer and closer to owning her. She tried to imagine what kind of horrible life awaited her with someone like that, but her mind refused to think about it. Just when it seemed like the nightmare man was about to make the winning bid, something unexpected happened. From the very back of the warehouse, in the shadows where Sophia hadn't even noticed anyone standing, a new voice called out a bid that was so high it made everyone in the room gasped. All heads turned to see who had spoken, and Sophia saw a man stepping forward from the darkness. He was completely different from everyone else in the room. While the other men looked like they belonged in this awful place, this stranger seemed as out of place as a flower in a garbage dump. The new bidder was probably in his 40s, with kind eyes and a face that looked like it smiled often, even though he wasn't smiling now. He was wearing simple clothes, just jeans and a plain jacket, not the expensive suits that everyone else had on. But what struck Sophia most was the way he looked at her, while all the other men stared at her with hunger and greed. This stranger looked at her with something that almost seemed like sadness and protectiveness. The auctioneer was so surprised by the huge bid that he actually stopped talking for a moment. The scary man in the front row turned around to glare at this newcomer, and Sophia could see anger burning in his dead eyes. He quickly made an even higher bid, clearly not willing to let anyone take away what he thought was going to be his, but the stranger from the back raised his hand again and called out another number that was even higher. The room fell completely silent except for the sound of Sophia's heart beating in her ears. She couldn't understand what was happening or why this different kind of man would want to bid on her, but something about his presence made her feel slightly less terrified. The bidding war between the nightmare man and the mysterious stranger continued for several more rounds. Each time one of them would bid, the other would immediately bid higher. The numbers being thrown around were so large that Sophia couldn't even imagine what that much money looked like. Finally, the stranger made a bid that was so enormous that even the rich men in the audience started murmuring in shock. The nightmare man's face turned red with rage, and he stood up from his chair like he was going to attack someone. But even he couldn't match such an incredible amount of money. The auctioneer asked 3 times if anyone wanted to bid higher, but the room stayed silent. The nightmare man sat back down heavily, his fists clenched and his eyes promising violence to someone, though Sophia couldn't tell who. When the hammer finally came down and the auction was declared over, Sophia felt a strange mixture of relief and new fear. She was glad that the terrifying man hadn't won her, but she had no idea what to expect from this mysterious stranger, who had just spent a fortune to buy her dot as the paperwork was being completed, and money was being transferred through phones and computers. Sophia tried to catch the stranger's eye. When she finally did, something passed between them that she couldn't quite understand. It wasn't the look of an owner examining his new property. It was something else entirely, something that gave her the first tiny spark of hope she had felt in days. The stranger walked toward the stage where Sophia was still standing under the hot lights, and she found herself holding her breath, waiting to discover what her fate would be with this unexpected savior or new captor. The stranger walked slowly towards Sophia, his footsteps echoing in the now quiet warehouse. Everyone else was busy with paperwork and money transfers, treating what had just happened like it was a normal business deal. But Sophia could see in this man's eyes that nothing about this was normal for him. When he reached the stage, he didn't climb up to claim her like she expected. Instead, he stood at the bottom and looked up at her with an expression she couldn't read. His face seemed tired, like he had been carrying a heavy weight for a long time. But there was also something else there, a determination that reminded Sophia of her mother when she was fighting her illness. "My name is David," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "And I want you to know that everything is about to change." Before Sophia could ask what he meant, David turned away from her and walked toward the center of the warehouse. He pulled something small from his jacket pocket. It looked like a phone, but Sophia had never seen one quite like it. David pressed a button, and suddenly the device made a loud beeping sound that cut through all the conversations in the room. "Attention, everyone," David said, his voice now loud and commanding, completely different from the gentle tone he had used with Sophia. "This is Agent David Rodriguez with the Federal Task Force on Human Trafficking. You are all under arrest." The effect of his words was like dropping a stone into a calm pond. For 1 second, nobody moved or spoke. Then chaos exploded throughout. The warehouse, the nightmare man who had been bidding against. David jumped up from his chair and started running toward a back exit. Several other men tried to follow him, pushing and shoving each other in their panic to escape. The auctioneer dropped his hammer and started shouting something about this being impossible, but David was ready for their reaction. As soon as he had finished speaking, doors all around the warehouse burst open and police officers in black uniforms came rushing in. They moved like they had practiced this exact situation many times before, quickly surrounding the panicked men and shouting orders for everyone to get on the ground. Sophia watched all of this happening from her position on the stage, feeling like she was in some kind of crazy dream. Just minutes ago, she had been about to be sold to a monster, and now police were arresting everyone in sight. Her mind couldn't keep up with how quickly everything was changing. The nightmare man almost made it to the back door, but 3 officers tackled him just before he could escape. As they put handcuffs on him, he started screaming threats about lawyers and connections, but the officers just ignored him and dragged him away. Within 20 minutes, every single person who had been in that auction was either in handcuffs or helping the police with their investigation. Sophia realized that some of the men she had thought were bidders were actually undercover police officers who had been working with David all along. When the immediate chaos was over, David came back to the stage where Sophia was still standing, trying to process everything she had just witnessed. He climbed up onto the platform and very gently started untying the ropes around her wrists. "You're safe now," he said as he worked on the knots. "Nobody is going to hurt you or buy you or sell you ever again." Sophia's legs felt weak, and she almost fell down, but David caught her arm to steady her. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You're a police officer? But you spent all that money. David smiled for the first time since she had seen him, and his whole face changed. He looked like someone's father, someone who probably helped his kids with homework and made pancakes on Sunday mornings. "I didn't actually spend any money," he explained. "That was all fake play money that we use in operations like this. The real trick was making sure I could outbid everyone else so that you wouldn't end up with any of those terrible men." As Sophia tried to absorb this information, David continued talking. "I've been working undercover for 3 months to break up this trafficking ring. We knew they were planning something big, but we didn't know exactly when or where until a few days ago." Sophia thought about her father and felt a confusing mixture of anger and sadness. "What about my father? He's the one who sold me to these people." David's expression became serious again. "Your father is already in custody. We arrested him this morning, right after you were taken from your house. He's going to face serious charges for what he did, but he's also going to get help for his gambling problem." The idea that her father was in jail should have made Sophia feel satisfied, but instead she just felt empty. Everything she had known about her life had been destroyed in just a few days. Her mother was dead, her father had betrayed her in the worst possible way, and now she was free but had nowhere to go. David seemed to understand what she was thinking without her having to say anything. "I know this is all overwhelming," he said gently. "You've been through something that no person should ever have to experience, but I want you to know that you're not alone." He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a business card. "There. are people who specialize in helping survivors of trafficking. They can provide you with counseling, legal help, and assistance finding a place to live while you figure out what you want to do next. Sophia took the card with hands that were still shaking slightly. She looked at it but couldn't really focus on the words. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life instead of living her own. But first, David continued, I want to offer you something else. My wife and I have 2 daughters, and we've been foster parents for several years. We have experience helping young people who have been through traumatic situations. If you're willing, you can stay with our family while you get back on your feet. Sophia looked up at him in surprise. After everything that had happened with her own father, the idea of trusting any adult man seemed impossible. But there was something about David that felt different. Maybe it was the way he had risked his own safety to save her, or maybe it was simply that he was offering help instead of trying to take something from her. Why would you want to help me? She asked. You don't even know me. David was quiet for a moment, and Sophia could see him thinking about how to answer. Finally, he said, I have daughters who are close to your age. When I saw you standing up here tonight, being treated like you were nothing more than an object to be sold, all I could think about was how I would feel if someone was doing this to one of my girls. He paused and looked around the warehouse, where police officers were still collecting evidence and taking statements. But more than that, I believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. What happened to you was wrong on every level, and if I can help make it right, then that's what I'm going to do. Sophia felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but for the first time in weeks, they weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of relief and gratitude and something else she hadn't felt in so long that she had almost forgotten what it was called: hope. 3 weeks after the warehouse raid, Sophia sat in the passenger seat of David's car as they drove through a quiet neighborhood filled with tree-lined streets and houses that looked like they belonged in a movie about perfect families. She pressed her face against the window, watching children ride bicycles on sidewalks and families working in their gardens. It was hard to believe that places like this really existed. Sophia had spent those 3 weeks in a safe house run by a kind woman named Mrs. Patricia, who specialized in helping trafficking survivors. The house was comfortable and secure, but Sophia had barely slept during her entire stay there. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of the warehouse, heard the auctioneer's voice, or remembered the look in the nightmare man's eyes. Mrs. Patricia had been patient with her, explaining that what Sophia was experiencing was completely normal for someone who had been through such trauma. She taught Sophia breathing exercises to help with the panic attacks and gave her journals to write down her thoughts and feelings. But most importantly, she helped Sophia understand that what had happened to her was not her fault. During those weeks, David had visited Sophia several times, always bringing his wife Rebecca with him. Rebecca was a teacher with warm brown eyes and a smile that reminded Sophia of her mother. She never asked Sophia uncomfortable questions or tried to push her to talk before she was ready. Instead, she would bring books, puzzles, or sometimes just sit quietly while Sophia processed everything that had happened. David had also kept Sophia updated on the legal proceedings against the trafficking ring. All 43 men who had been arrested that night were facing serious charges. The Nightmare Man, whose real name was Vincent Torres, turned out to be wanted in 5 different states for similar crimes. He would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Sophia's father was a more complicated situation. David explained that while Carlos would definitely face consequences for what he had done, the prosecutors were also considering his gambling addiction and the desperate circumstances that had led to his terrible decision. Sophia wasn't sure how she felt about that. Part of her wanted him to suffer for betraying her, but another part of her still remembered the loving father he had been before her mother got sick. Now, as they pulled into the driveway of a 2-story house with blue shutters and a front porch decorated with hanging flower baskets, Sophia felt her stomach fill with butterflies. David and Rebecca had invited her to stay with them, but Sophia was terrified of being a burden or somehow not fitting into their family. The front door opened before they even got out of the car, and two teenage girls came running out, the older. One looked about 17, with curly red hair and freckles scattered across her nose like stars. The younger one was probably 15, with straight black hair and the same kind eyes as her father. "You must be Sophia," the older girl said, practically bouncing with excitement. "I'm Jessica, and this is my sister Lily. We've been so excited to meet you." Lily was more shy than her sister, but she gave Sophia a warm smile and offered to help carry her bag. Sophia only had one small suitcase. Mrs. Patricia had taken her shopping for basic necessities. But Sophia still felt strange accepting so many gifts from people she barely knew. Inside the house, Sophia was amazed by how normal and comfortable everything felt. The living room had mismatched furniture that somehow looked perfect together. Family photos covering every surface, and the lingering smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. It was exactly the opposite of the cold, formal houses she had cleaned in her village. Rebecca showed Sophia to a small bedroom on the second floor that had been decorated in soft purple and yellow colors. There was a desk by the window, bookshelves lining one wall, and a bed covered with a quilt that looked like it had been made by hand. "This used to be our guest room," Rebecca explained, "but we've been hoping for a while that we might have another daughter to share it with. If you decide to stay with us, we can redecorate it however you like." Sophia touched the quilt gently, running her fingers over the intricate stitching. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I've never had my own room before." That evening at dinner, Sophia sat around the table with David's family and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: normalcy. Jessica talked excitedly about her upcoming senior year of high school and her plans to study journalism in college. Lily was quieter but shared stories about her art class and showed Sophia some of her drawings. David and Rebecca treated Sophia exactly like they treated their own daughters, asking her opinion about things, including her in family jokes, and making sure she felt like she belonged. But Sophia could also see that they were being careful not to overwhelm her or push her to share more than she was comfortable with. After dinner, while David and Rebecca were cleaning up in the kitchen, Jessica and Lily took Sophia up to their rooms to show her around. Jessica's room was covered with posters of bands Sophia had never heard of and stacks of books about famous journalists. Lily's room was like a small art studio, with easels, paint supplies, and canvases covering every available surface. "Dad told us a little bit about what happened to you," Jessica said carefully as they sat on her bed. "Not the details, just that you've been through something really hard. We want you to know that we're here if you ever want to talk, but we also understand if you need space." Lily nodded in agreement. "When I first came to live here, I was really scared and didn't trust anyone. David and Rebecca gave me all the time I needed to feel safe." Sophia looked at Lily in surprise. "You're adopted too?" "Foster care first, then adopted," Lily explained. "My birth parents couldn't take care of me because of drug problems. I was in 3 different homes before I came here when I was 12. David and Rebecca were the first adults who made me feel like I was worth keeping." Hearing Lily's story made Sophia feel less alone. She had been wondering if she was the only person who had ever felt so lost and broken, but clearly that wasn't true. And if Lily could heal and become part of this loving family, maybe Sophia could too. Over the next few weeks, Sophia slowly began to settle into life with the Rodriguez family. Rebecca helped her enroll in online classes to finish her high school education, something Sophia had always dreamed of doing but never thought would be possible. David taught her how to drive in the empty parking lot of a nearby school, patiently explaining the rules of the road while Sophia gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. Jessica became like the big sister Sophia had always wanted, teaching her about makeup and fashion while also discussing books and current events. Lily shared her love of art with Sophia, showing her different painting techniques and encouraging her to express her feelings through colors and shapes. But the most important thing the family gave Sophia was time. Time to heal, time to remember who she was before the tragedy, and time to figure out who she wanted to become. They never pressured her to get over what had happened or to move forward faster than she was ready. Some days were harder than others. Sophia still had nightmares and panic attacks. Sometimes she would hear a man's voice in a store and freeze with terror, remembering the auctioneer or one of the bidders. But David and Rebecca had connected her with a therapist who specialized in trauma, and slowly, Sophia began to understand that healing was possible. One evening, about 2 months after moving in with the Rodriguez family, Sophia was helping Rebecca prepare dinner when she realized something had changed. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt genuinely happy. Not just safe or grateful, but actually happy to be alive and excited about the future. 2 years later, Sophia stood in front of a mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the collar of her new navy blue suit. Today was the most important day of her life since that terrible night in the warehouse, but this time she was nervous for all the right reasons. In just 1 hour, she would be giving a speech at the grand opening of the city's first specialized center for trafficking survivors. The girl, looking back at her from the mirror, was almost unrecognizable from the terrified 19-year-old who had once stood on an auction stage. Sophia's eyes still held the same green intensity, but now they sparkled with confidence and purpose instead of fear. Her long black hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and her posture spoke of someone who had found her strength. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. After finishing her high school diploma through online classes, Sophia had thrown herself into college studies with a determination that amazed everyone around her. She chose social work as her major, despite the fact that it meant constantly confronting the very issues that had once nearly destroyed her life. Her professors had initially worried that studying human trafficking and victim advocacy might be too triggering for someone with her background. But Sophia had proven them wrong time and again. Instead of being overwhelmed by the material, she approached it with a unique understanding that couldn't be taught from textbooks. During her sophomore year, Sophia had started volunteering at a local women's shelter. At first, she mostly helped with basic tasks like serving meals and organizing donations. But soon, the other volunteers and staff members noticed that survivors seemed to open up to Sophia in ways they didn't with other counselors. There was something about Sophia's presence that immediately put traumatized women at ease. Maybe it was the way she listened without judgment, or the fact that her eyes held a recognition of pain that couldn't be faked. Whatever it was, Sophia had a gift for helping people feel safe enough to begin healing. Mrs. Rodriguez had come to watch Sophia give her speech today, along with David and both of her sisters. Jessica was now in her second year of journalism school and had written several articles about human trafficking that were published in the college newspaper. Lily had just started her senior year of high school and was planning to study art therapy. Inspired by watching Sophia's journey, the Rodriguez family had officially adopted Sophia 8 months ago on her 21st birthday. The adoption ceremony had been small and private, but Sophia remembered it as one of the happiest days of her life. Having a real family again, people who loved her unconditionally and believed in her dreams, had given her the foundation she needed to rebuild herself completely. Sophia's work at the shelter had led to an internship with the same task force that David worked for. She started by helping interview trafficking survivors, using her own experience to build trust and gather information that helped prosecutors build stronger cases against traffickers. One of her first cases had involved a 17-year-old girl named Aina who had been brought to the country illegally and forced to work in a factory under terrible conditions. Aina spoke very little English and was terrified of all authority figures, including the social workers trying to help her. But when Sophia sat down with Aina and began speaking to her in Spanish, sharing pieces of her own story, something changed. Aina began to open up, first just a little, then more and more as she realized that Sophia truly understood what she had been through. With Sophia's help, Aina not only provided crucial testimony that led to the arrest of her traffickers, but also began her own journey toward healing and independence. That case had convinced Sophia that she wanted to dedicate her life to this work. After graduating with her bachelor's degree in social work, she had applied for and received a grant to start the city's first comprehensive center specifically designed for trafficking survivors. The center, which would officially open today, offered everything a survivor might need in one location. There were counselors who specialized in trauma therapy, legal advocates who could help with immigration issues and criminal cases, job training programs, and even temporary housing for people who had nowhere safe to go. But Sophia's proudest achievement was the peer support program she had designed. Survivors who had successfully rebuilt their lives, like herself, would be trained to work with newer survivors, providing the kind of understanding and hope that could only come from someone who had walked the same dark path as Sophia walked. Into the main conference room of the center, she saw about 50 people gathered for the opening ceremony. There were city officials, police officers from David's task force, social workers, and several survivors who had already begun using the center's services. In the front row, she spotted a familiar face that made her heart skip a beat. Her father, Carlos, sat quietly with his hands folded in his lap. He looked older and thinner than she remembered, and his eyes held a sadness that seemed to have settled permanently in his features. Carlos had been released from prison 6 months ago after serving his sentence. Through her therapist, Sophia had eventually agreed to meet with him, though it had taken over a year for her to feel ready for that conversation. The meeting had been painful and awkward, with both of them crying and apologizing for different reasons. Carlos had gotten help for his gambling addiction while in prison, and was now working at a construction job, trying to rebuild his life in whatever way he could. He had asked Sophia for forgiveness, but he had also told her that he understood if she could never give it to him. The fact that he was here today, supporting her work despite everything that had happened between them, meant more to Sophia than she had expected it would. When Sophia stepped up to the podium to give her speech, the room fell completely silent. She looked out at the faces staring back at her, some hopeful, some skeptical, some carrying their own invisible scars from experiences similar to hers. 2 years ago, Sophia began, her voice clear and strong, I stood in a warehouse where men were bidding on me like I was an object they could buy and sell. I thought my life was over. I thought I would never feel safe or happy or valuable ever again. She paused and looked directly at Aina, who was sitting in the third row. Aina was now 18, spoke fluent English, and was working as a translator for other survivors while studying to become a nurse. But I was wrong, Sophia continued. What I learned is that our worst moments don't define us. What defines us is what we choose to do after those moments pass. Today, this center opens as proof that survivors don't just survive, we thrive. We heal, and we help others do the same. Sophia spent the next 20 minutes talking about the services the center would provide, but she also shared stories carefully protecting people's privacy about the survivors she had worked with who had gone on to rebuild amazing lives. She talked about women who had become teachers, business owners, advocates, and mothers. She talked about the strength that comes not from never being broken, but from learning how to put yourself back together. When she finished her speech, the entire room stood up and applauded. But Sophia wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. She was looking at David and Rebecca, who were both crying and beaming with pride. She was looking at Jessica and Lily, who had become the sisters she never knew. She needed. And she was even looking at her father, who was wiping tears from his eyes and nodding at her with something that looked like amazement. That evening, as Sophia sat in her childhood bedroom in the Rodriguez house, because it would always be her home, no matter how old she got, she pulled out the journal Mrs. Patricia had given her during those first difficult weeks. She turned to a fresh page and began to write. Today I realized something important, she wrote. The girl who was almost sold in that warehouse is gone. But she didn't disappear because someone broke her. She transformed because people loved her back to life. And now, every day, I get to be part of loving other people back to life too. I think that might be the most beautiful thing in the world.